For 18 years, a woman lived alone on an island in the Pacific Ocean. Not isolated in the modern sense, not temporarily stranded, not waiting with certainty for rescue. She lived without knowing whether another human being would ever appear again. What makes this story unsettling isn't that she survived. It's that her survival happened almost entirely unnoticed. For nearly 2 decades, the world functioned as though she did not exist. If you're enjoying the story, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. You can also explore more videos for other stories like this. Now, let's return to our tale. Where can I place this on this story? San Nicolas Island sits far off the coast of Southern California, exposed to the Pacific in a way few places are. It is long and narrow, shaped by erosion rather than intention, carved continuously by wind, salt, and time. This is not an island that welcomes people. Wind rarely settles. Fog arrives unannounced and lingers without apology. Rain is unpredictable, and fresh water is scarce enough to determine the rhythm of life itself. Vegetation grows low, pressed close to the earth, sculpted by constant exposure. The island does not forgive carelessness, yet for thousands of years people lived here. Long before European ships cut across the horizon, the Nicoleno people built a life on this land through observation rather than domination. They learned the island's limits and respected them. They understood tides, currents, wind patterns, and seasons with an accuracy refined across generations. They harvested abalone from tidal pools, fished among kelp forests offshore, hunted seals along the coast, and constructed watercraft capable of navigating open ocean. Their isolation was not a weakness. It was a system. For centuries, it worked, until it didn't. In the early 19th century, the Pacific coast became a corridor for exploitation. Russian fur traders arrived, driven by international demand for sea otter pelts. With them came Aleut hunters, new weapons, unfamiliar diseases, and a form of violence the island had never absorbed before. The consequences were swift. Food systems collapsed as otter populations were decimated. Disease spread unchecked through communities with no immunity. Social structures fractured under pressure they were never designed to withstand. Within a few decades, the Nicoleno population declined catastrophically. What had endured for millennia unraveled in a generation. By the 1830s, only a small number of Nicoleno people remained on San Nicolas Island. They were no longer protected by isolation. They were vulnerable, politically invisible, and increasingly dependent on forces they did not control. In 1835, Spanish Franciscan missionaries decided to remove them from the island and relocate them to the mainland. The justification was protection. The reality was haste. A single schooner was sent. The operation was poorly planned. Weather conditions deteriorated. Confusion spread as people attempted to board with what little they could carry. There was no systematic accounting, no careful verification that everyone had been gathered. When the ship finally departed, it left one person behind: a woman. No one knows precisely how it happened. Some accounts suggest she was searching for a missing child. Others say she was simply overlooked in the chaos. Later retellings embellished the moment, adding motive and drama, but historians agree on one thing: the exact circumstances are unknowable. What followed is not. As the ship disappeared beyond the horizon, the woman stood alone on the island. Not temporarily, not symbolically, literally alone. She may not have been alone immediately. Some accounts suggest a young son remained with her for a short time. If true, his survival was brief. One version of the story says he drowned attempting to cross rough water in a small canoe. Whether this detail is accurate or not, the outcome was the same. Soon, there was no one left who spoke her language. No one to share labor. No one to exchange memory. No one to confirm her existence. Silence took over completely. At that moment, she did not know she was the last living member of her people. She only knew that no one was coming back. Years had already passed by then, and the island had become the only place where her life still made sense. There's a moment in every long isolation when the mind stops treating the situation as temporary. We don't know exactly when that moment arrived for her. There was no calendar, no one to mark the passage from hope into acceptance. But it had to arrive, because surviving a few weeks alone is one kind of challenge. Surviving years requires a different posture entirely. Waiting for rescue drains energy. Building a life preserves it. At some point, the island stopped being a place she was trapped on and became the only world she could depend on. That shift, subtle, internal, irreversible, is what allowed her to live. The island offered no generosity by default. Every resource had to be earned through attention. She understood this landscape not as an enemy, but as a system that demanded accuracy. She paid attention to wind direction, not out of curiosity, but because shelter placement could mean the difference between safety and collapse during storms. She studied fog patterns because fog brought moisture, and moisture meant water. She learned which low points in the rock collected rainfall and which evaporated too quickly to rely on. Fresh water dictated everything. It determined how far she could travel from shelter, how much labor she could sustain in a day, how much food she could safely preserve. There was no margin for waste. Her shelters reflected long familiarity rather than improvisation. One of the primary structures she built used the rib bones of a massive whale, likely stranded long before her abandonment. The bones formed an arched frame, strong enough to resist wind when anchored correctly. Driftwood filled gaps. Grass and earth sealed the walls. This was not desperation architecture. It was inherited knowledge applied carefully. She built more than one dwelling, adjusting to seasons and weather. Some shelters prioritized warmth, others prioritized ventilation. Placement was deliberate, never random. Every decision carried accumulated experience. Tools had to be remade constantly. Stone dulls, bone fractures, sinew stretches and weakens. Without metal, nothing lasts forever. She shaped stone blades repeatedly, refining edges with patience rather than force. Bone needles were carved, tested, discarded, and replaced. Containers for water and food were fashioned from available materials and monitored constantly for leaks or cracks. Every object had a lifespan. Knowing when something would fail mattered as much as knowing how to use it. Clothing was crafted with care. Seal skins provided insulation. Bird feathers offered lightness and flexibility. Stitching with sinew required focus and endurance. Sewing without metal tools is slow, and mistakes are costly. A torn seam could expose skin to wind and cold. A poorly fitted garment could reduce mobility. Archaeological evidence shows consistency and refinement in her work. These were not crude survival attempts. They were solutions perfected through repetition. Food gathering followed strict patterns. Shellfish were collected only at specific tides. Certain rocks revealed abalone briefly, then concealed them again. Timing mattered. Fishing depended on conditions offshore. Kelp forests provided shelter for fish, but required careful navigation. Birds were hunted when accessible, their feathers saved, their meat preserved. Seals were taken sparingly. Hunting them required risk and precision. The reward was significant, but the cost of failure could be severe. Meat was dried using wind and time rather than fire whenever possible. Preservation meant survival during scarcity. Nothing was casual. Water remained the greatest constant threat. Rainfall was unpredictable. Natural basins in stone became lifelines. She monitored them carefully, guarding against contamination, evaporation, and loss. She learned exactly how much her body required to function. Thirst was not ignored, but it was managed. The island forced discipline. The physical demands were relentless. There were no days off, no shared labor, no one to compensate for illness or injury. Every task fell to her alone. Yet physical exhaustion was not the most dangerous element of her situation. Isolation was. Extended solitude strips away the external scaffolding that supports identity. Without conversation, without feedback, without shared language, the mind begins to lose reference points. Many documented cases of long-term isolation end in disorientation, hallucination, or psychological collapse. She resisted that outcome deliberately. Evidence suggests she sang regularly. That detail matters. Singing requires memory, rhythm, breath control, intention. Songs have structure, beginnings, endings, repetition, variation. Singing alone, without an audience, asserts that meaning exists even when no one else is present to confirm it. The songs she carried belonged to a culture that no longer existed anywhere else. Each melody preserved fragments of language no one could speak back to her. She sang to keep them alive. Speech likely continued as well. Archaeologists believe she spoke aloud, possibly to animals, possibly to the sea, possibly to herself. Sound breaks isolation. Even self-generated sound reinforces the reality of existence. Silence, left unchecked, becomes oppressive. She did not allow it to dominate. Time was shaped rather than measured. Without clocks or calendars, she created routine. Tasks repeated in predictable sequences. Certain days focused on gathering, others on repair, others on rest. There is evidence suggesting she marked time using carved sticks or patterned notations. These were not precise records. They were anchors, small acts of order imposed on a world that no longer acknowledged her presence. Routine stabilized the mind. Years accumulated quietly. Storms battered the island repeatedly. Shelters collapsed and were rebuilt. Tools improved incrementally. Bone structures bleached further under the sun. The island changed slowly. She adapted continuously. During all of this, the world beyond San Nicolas Island did not notice. Ships passed without altering course. Rumors faded into irrelevance. Maps remained unchanged. On the mainland, the Nicoleno people who had survived relocation died within a few years, mostly from disease. Their language vanished. Their stories ended without record. She did not know she was now the last living archive of an entire people. But she was. Every word she spoke existed nowhere else. Every song lived only in her memory. Every practice survived only through her repetition. History had narrowed to a single human body. At some point, survival ceased to feel exceptional. It became ordinary. This may be the most difficult aspect to understand. Her life did not feel like a story to her. It felt like continuity. Tasks followed tasks. Seasons followed seasons. The island remained. Waiting disappeared. Living remained. That change mattered more than any tool she ever made. There is a psychological weight that comes not from loneliness itself, but from duration. Most human beings can endure isolation briefly. Weeks, even months, can be survived with the belief that separation is temporary. What changes a person is not silence alone, but the absence of an ending. At some point, the question stops being, "How long can I last?" and becomes, "What does lasting even mean?" For her, isolation was no longer a condition. It was the environment. By the second decade, survival no longer required improvisation. It required maintenance. Every object she depended on carried a history of repair. Tools bore the marks of reshaping rather than creation. Shelters reflected revision rather than construction. Nothing she used was new. Everything had been adapted, adjusted, reinforced. This is how long-term endurance reveals itself, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through refusal to allow small failures to accumulate. A torn seam was addressed immediately. A cracked container was replaced before it leaked. A dull edge was reshaped before it became useless. She lived ahead of breakdown. Memory became her most fragile resource. Without reinforcement, memories distort. They fade, bend, lose detail. Faces blur, names dissolve, songs slip out of sequence. She fought that erosion actively. Singing did not merely preserve melody, it preserved order. Verses came in sequence, repetition anchored recall. Rhythm stabilized language. Each performance renewed what would otherwise disappear. She also preserved behavior. Certain movements, ways of preparing food, arranging tools, positioning shelter, were done as they had always been done. Not because alternatives were unavailable, but because continuity mattered. Repetition becomes ritual when no community exists to enforce it. Ritual becomes identity. At some point, without knowing it, she crossed a line no human being should ever have to cross. She became the sole living representative of an entire culture. Language, stripped of speakers, narrows quickly. Without conversation, grammar loosens. Vocabulary shrinks to what is immediately necessary. Abstract ideas lose expression. She may have spoken less as years passed, not from inability, but from practicality. There was no one left to speak to. Yet language lived on inside her, unshared, unrecorded, unanswered. This is what extinction looks like when it happens quietly. No final ceremony, no last witness to record it. Just one person continuing to exist after everything that made existence shared has vanished. The island itself bore witness in ways no one noticed at the time. Patterns of movement appeared in the landscape. Frequently traveled paths became visible through wear. Certain areas showed repeated use. Archaeological traces indicate deliberate organization rather than randomness. She was not wandering. She was operating within a mental map refined over years. Time, unmeasured by clocks, became elastic. Days did not stand out individually. They grouped themselves into cycles, storm seasons, dry stretches, periods of abundance followed by scarcity. Rather than counting time, she responded to it. The future shrank to manageable distances. Planning extended weeks ahead, sometimes months, but rarely beyond that. Long-term projection without reinforcement becomes mentally expensive. Survival narrows focus. There is no evidence that she attempted escape. This detail is often misunderstood. It is not a failure of imagination or courage. It is a calculation. The waters surrounding San Nicolas Island are unpredictable. Small vessels require not only skill, but favorable conditions and recovery options if something goes wrong. Attempting a crossing alone would have risked immediate death. Staying offered continuity. Staying allowed control. Isolation also reshapes emotion. Without social reference points, feelings lose labels. Grief cannot be shared. Anger finds no recipient. Joy carries no echo. Emotions still occur, but they pass differently. They do not spiral outward. They settle inward. This internalization likely protected her. Outward expression without response often amplifies distress. Inward processing, while difficult, can stabilize it. She did not dramatize her suffering. There is no evidence of ritualized despair, no sign of symbolic gestures marking loss or abandonment. Her behavior reflects acceptance rather than protest. Acceptance is often mistaken for resignation. They are not the same. Resignation stops action. Acceptance redirects it. At some point during those years, the idea of rescue likely lost urgency. Not hope exactly, but expectation. Expectation is heavy. It consumes energy. It distorts priorities. Letting go of expectation frees attention. Her focus remained on what could be done, not what might happen. The island became quieter as years passed. Animal populations shifted. Weather patterns altered subtly. Materials degraded further. She adjusted. Adaptation never stopped. Beyond the island, the world continued. Trade expanded. Settlements grew. Records were kept. Lives were documented. Deaths were noted. She existed outside all of it. Her presence altered nothing beyond the island's boundaries. That absence of impact is what makes her endurance extraordinary. Survival without acknowledgement requires a different kind of strength. And then, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, something interrupted that pattern. Eventually, something changed. Not on the island, but elsewhere. Along the coast, sailors began noticing signs that didn't fit expectations. Traces of habitation where none should exist, evidence too consistent to ignore entirely. Most dismissed the rumors. One man did not. Captain George Nidover had spent years navigating these waters. He was familiar with exaggeration, but also with the ease by which assumptions replace verification. Curiosity, more than conviction, drove him. He organized a small expedition, not a rescue mission, an inquiry. When his crew landed on San Nicolas Island, they did not find a person. They found order, structures arranged deliberately, tools placed with intention. Food remains indicating ongoing activity. Someone was here. Recently. They searched. No response. No movement. Only silence. It was not until the final evening that she revealed herself. She had observed them long before they noticed her. Years of solitude refined patience. Her approach was not hesitant. She did not hide. She carried food. Roasted wild onions, prepared deliberately. This gesture matters. It signals recognition without submission. It communicates willingness without fear. Food is the oldest language. She spoke it clearly. Communication between them was limited, but not absent. No shared vocabulary existed, yet meaning passed through gesture, tone, and presence. She sang. One of the crew later remembered the song as expressing readiness, contentment, rather than urgency. After 18 years, she chose to leave. Leaving the island did not begin with celebration. There was no sudden rush, no visible relief, no dramatic collapse into safety. After nearly 2 decades of self-reliance, transition did not come with emotion that could be easily read by others. She did not run toward the boat. She stepped into it. That distinction matters. Choice, even after long isolation, carries dignity. The journey to the mainland was short in distance, but vast in consequence. Water that had once been a boundary became a passage. The horizon, which for years had offered no promise, finally shifted. For the first time in 18 years, she was no longer alone. That did not mean she was safe. That fact alone did not immediately register as comfort. Human presence after such duration is not automatically reassuring. It is unfamiliar, unpredictable, loud. The island had trained her in consistency. The world she was returning to offered none. When she arrived in Santa Barbara, curiosity gathered quickly. Word spread fast. A woman who had lived alone for nearly 20 years was not merely unusual, it was unprecedented. People came to look at her, some out of fascination, some out of sympathy, some out of disbelief. She did not perform for them. Accounts describe her as calm, observant, unhurried. She examined objects with interest rather than awe. Horses, buildings, tools, clothing. Items whose purpose she could infer without explanation. She was not overwhelmed, she was assessing. Her behavior surprised many. There was no visible resentment, no apparent anger, no recounting of hardship. She did not narrate suffering because suffering had not been her focus. Survival had required attention to function, not reflection. Words for trauma require listeners. She had learned to live without them. Yet while her mind adjusted cautiously, her body struggled immediately. Her physiology had adapted over years to scarcity, to a narrow and controlled diet, to predictable exposure. The abundance offered to her, meant as kindness, became a burden. New foods disrupted systems that had stabilized over time. Bacteria unfamiliar to her immune defenses overwhelmed it quickly. Pathogens she had never encountered found no resistance. Her strength, built through adaptation, became vulnerability. Within weeks, she fell ill. Accounts suggest dysentery as the most likely cause, though precise diagnosis was beyond the medical knowledge of the time. What is certain is that her condition deteriorated rapidly. The irony is stark. She had endured storms, hunger, injury, and silence for nearly 18 years. She did not survive 7 weeks of society. Before her death, a decision was made on her behalf. She was baptized by a Franciscan priest and given a Spanish name, Juana Maria. The ceremony was brief. It marked the first and last time her identity was formally recorded. Her original name, spoken in the sounds of her people, was never documented. No one present could understand her language well enough to write it down. No interpreter existed. No shared vocabulary remained. Her true name disappeared with her. She died in October of 1853. There were no relatives to claim her body, no cultural rites to guide burial, no instructions recorded because communication had never reached that level of clarity. She was buried in an unmarked grave at the Santa Barbara Mission Cemetery, among strangers. The disappearance did not end there. Artifacts recovered from San Nicolas Island, tools, containers, clothing, were later housed in museums and collections. Many were destroyed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and the fires that followed. One object in particular became emblematic of her craftsmanship, a dress made entirely from cormorant feathers, assembled with extraordinary precision. It was reportedly sent overseas for study. It never returned. Its location remains unknown. Even the physical evidence of her endurance was gradually erased. For decades, her story existed only as fragmented records and second-hand recollections. No biography was written, no first-hand testimony survived. She remained a footnote. It was not until the early 20th century that a small memorial plaque was placed near her burial site. An acknowledgement long delayed, insufficient, but symbolic. By then, almost everything she represented had already vanished. Later, her story resurfaced in fiction. A novelist would reshape her life into a narrative meant for children, softening isolation into adventure, turning endurance into inspiration. The book traveled widely, introducing her story to generations who never learned her real circumstances. Archaeology, however, told a different story. Excavations on San Nicolas Island confirmed long-term habitation by a single individual. Whalebone structures, carefully shaped tools. Food remains consistent with solitary survival. The evidence did not suggest myth. It confirmed persistence. What makes her story difficult is that it offers no comfort. There is no moral arc, no redemption through rescue. No triumph rewarded by recognition. There is only continuity. She did not seek isolation. It was imposed. She did not become extraordinary through ambition. She became extraordinary through refusal. Refusal to disappear. Refusal to surrender to silence. Refusal to let neglect become erasure. She lived, and the world barely noticed. Her life does not resolve into meaning the way stories usually demand. There is no lesson that balances the loss, no final exchange that restores what vanished. When she died, nothing was returned to her people, because there were no people left to receive it. What survived was not a culture, but evidence that one had existed long enough for a single person to carry it alone. History often measures endurance by impact. What changed, what spread, what endured beyond an individual lifespan. By that standard, her life barely registers. She founded nothing. She led no movement. She left no descendants. The world she re-entered did not bend around her presence, and it did not remember her accurately afterward. But that framework is inadequate here. Her endurance mattered not because it altered history, but because it resisted erasure. For 18 years, systems designed to absorb, replace, or forget human lives failed to do so completely. Bureaucracy forgot her. Disease erased her people. Trade networks bypassed her island. Records ignored her. And still, she remained. She did not preserve her culture in a way that could be transferred. She preserved it in the only way left, by continuing to enact it when no one else could see. Each tool repaired, each shelter rebuilt. Each song repeated without listener extended something already condemned to disappear. Extinction is often imagined as a dramatic endpoint, a final moment, a clear line between before and after. Her life exposes a quieter reality. Sometimes extinction stretches across years, carried forward by one person who does not know they are holding the last thread. When she stepped onto the mainland, that thread finally broke. Not because she failed, but because continuity requires more than survival. It requires reception. Memory needs witnesses. Language needs response. Culture needs more than one body. She was never meant to carry it alone. What remains now is absence shaped by proof. Archaeological traces confirm she lived deliberately. Historical records confirm she was real. Fiction confirms how uncomfortable the truth was for those who inherited it. And perhaps that is the final weight of her story. Not that she survived alone, but that the world allowed her to. She lived at the edge of history, not because she belonged there, but because history did not make space for her anywhere else. And when she was finally noticed, it was already too late to hear what she carried. So the story does not end with rescue. It ends with acknowledgement, delayed, partial, insufficient. She lived, she endured, and almost everything she represented vanished with her. That is not inspiration. It is a record. And records, unlike myths, do not ask to be comforting. They only ask to be remembered. Thank you for staying with this story. If you'd like to hear more histories told with patience and care, you're welcome to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any new stories we share.